Hello everyone, we are back once again with yet another Eon Flux recording. This time of episode 4, A Last Time for Everything. So again, I'm going to try not to repeat myself, otherwise making these videos would be pointless. But this is a hell of an episode. Trevor is making clones. And they don't even call them clones, which is interesting. In the title crawl, they just call them human duplicates, which implies there's an even more creepy scientific way of duplicating a person that doesn't even involve the process of actual cloning, like taking an embryo and cloning it. They're not even clones. They're far further removed from that. They're duplicates. And again, Trevor, in his fashion, is externalizing his own failed efforts to understand himself by making a whole bunch of clones and then imprisoning them and testing them to find out what their flaws are. He's like this mad gem cutter who's like, I'm not interested in finding my own flaws. I'm not interested in improving myself. I'm interested in externalizing my desire to do so, using other people as living human fodder for my own psychosis. And that's what that whole scene represents. It's like, well, if I can fuck with other people enough, I won't have to confront myself. And now here we have Eon and her assassin friend, Red and Black. There's an interesting book that's hard to find. It's called Red Square, Black Square. And it looks at the political system of communism not based on its politics or its economics, but its aesthetics. And I think that is the way to look at any system. Look at what its aesthetics are. What symbols, what visions, what shapes, what constructs, what buildings, what clothing. That's what defines a system, not its economics and not its politics. And the fact that we have Eon and her Russian accented friend here, and they're red and black. The book Red Square, Black Square came out in the mid-90s around the same time as this show. So it's possible that the makers of the show had some encounter with it, but who knows? Could just be a random association from my brain. Anything I say could be a random association. In fact, everything I say is a random association from my brain. That's true of everybody. So, take everything with a grain of salt. Put some salt in your morning coffee. Put a grain of salt on your tongue. So Eon has made her way through this border area. She's crossed the border between the hemispheres of the brain because she can't stand that Trevor is using creepy Aperture Science, Fallout 4 Institute type shit. Scaphandra, that's the name of the Russian chick. And Trevor's got a bunch of his creepy goons, probably bred just for this purpose, to intimidate prisoners. That's probably their only function. Trevor's like, I just keep them around to be creepy goons. Kind of like the fat, grizzly guys you see in anime doujins. They only exist to be a creepy counterpart to the beautiful women. It's the contrast of creepiness and beauty. That's what gets me off. And anyway, of course, she's got hands for feet, which is, again, a very ape-brain, Cro-Magnon, ook monkey reference to evolution. She's ironically used technology, a very futuristic, sophisticated system, to return her body to a previous state. So she's misused technology like a rebel or an assassin might to regress. And Trevor sniffs her armpit. Maybe he's got an armpit fetish. Oh no, it turns out it's far worse than that. And he puts a worm in her spine. Well, it's not a worm. It's a extraction tube, because he wants to get her cerebrospinal fluid, which is what he uses to clone people. And of course, Eon rips her own armpit open. And again, they're just playing games with each other. Eon doesn't care what Trevor's doing. And Trevor doesn't care that Eon knows what he's doing. They don't care. They're just play fucking in elaborate, non-physical ways. That's all they're doing. And then I love this scene. This is one of the most insane scenes ever animated by anyone. It's so crazy or fucking weird. In what situation would that tech be useful except for this specific scene? It's so nuts. And Trevor confronts Eon. He goes, humans are just amino acids. Just amino acids, bro. And she tempts him by using his own logic against him, by saying, well, by your logic, you're trafficking in excess. And Trevor goes, no, you're wrong. Wrong again. The language game you're playing with me isn't that easy. The issue is not excess, but access. And Eon points out the fatal male flaw. I want to fuck 10 women and have 30 children or 50 children with them. I want to copy my genetic imperative forever. And she's going, that's your flaw. But I'm going to use it to tempt you, not with my words, but with my actions. And then he tries to lure her back, and she knows he's going to by saying, oh, this doesn't concern you, because he thinks Eon is tempted by his opposition to her. But that's not what's motivating her. What's motivating her is actually trying to save this guy. I think Eon's actually the good guy in this series, which is going to be controversial because a lot of people see her as the villain. But I think she's actually trying to save Trevor from his own bullshit. And he's just too stupid to see it. He's too wrapped up in his own epic ideas, his own machinations. His scientific focus has rotted the intuitive part of his brain. He can no longer actually be a person. That's the tragedy of Trevor Goodchild. He's brilliant. He might even be benevolent in some cases. He might even create advancements that will benefit all of humanity. But he's lost his soul. He's lost his sense of who he is. Or he's ignored who he is in his pursuits. And here's his little Eon fuck doll, his little epic VTuber clone. And he says, I have you any way I want. This episode, in a lot of ways, it mogs both Blade Runner and Blade Runner 2049. It's so goddamn good, and it's only 23 minutes long. That's crazy. That's why I love this show. The level of information compression in it is ridiculous. It's unprecedented. I've not seen anything else other than a book that is able to compress information like this. Of course, she goes into water, feminine element. I may have said that last time. And it's like Eon doesn't even care she's cloned. She has no existential crisis. She's looking at her teeth like a horse. He goes, oh, you're pretty good. And she goes, the lab is easy. Yes, it is. But Trevor isn't. Because now, ironically, Eon talks about Trevor's ego. But Eon is using a clone of herself to do what she can't bring herself to do with Trevor. She can't actually approach him and get to know who he is. That's her fear. And she doesn't realize that she's doing exactly what Trevor's doing. Trevor had to make a clone to fuck Eon. He had to maintain a sort of safe distance from her real self. Eon is, ironically, trying to get to know Trevor through that same clone. And so she's taking advantage of that same distance between her, the real Eon, and Trevor. Because it's safe. Because if anybody gets hurt, it's the clone. The poor clone, in this case. The poor human copy. That's the real abused person. Hashtag clone rights. Hashtag clonegate. Clone? Clown? Interesting, those are similar. And again, Trevor goes, you can fuck me finally, or this version of you can, and it won't affect your career as a spy, and it won't affect my career. And Eon's like, well, I'm bored, because now that you're in control, if I have no agency, if I have no ability to switch, and I'm using that term in a sexual sense as well as a literal sense, if I can't switch the relationship of the dom-sub, then what's the point? It's going to get boring if it's all one way. It's almost like, again, the series is talking about the two sides of the brain. It's talking about if that relationship is too one-sided for too long, it gets boring. And boredom kills everything. Boredom is the silent killer no one talks about. It kills everything. It kills entire societies. It's why we have video games, and it's why we had card games and chessboards. It's why we've had the game Go, the ancient Japanese game. We've had that for over 1,000 years, at least. It's because combating boredom during times of prosperity, as well as during times of war and famine, is more important than anything else. Because it's not just the unwashed masses of NPCs that get bored and do stupid things, it's the elites. If the elites are also bored, that's equally bad. And again, it all just comes back to balance. All you have to fucking do is spend enough time to get to know yourself. And that's not easy. I've trivialized that phrase because I've used it in these reviews. That process of getting to know yourself, it might take 15 years of your life. It's a big fucking time investment. It's not a small thing. You might be able to do it in a year, but most people won't. And again, look at this. Trevor has cloned her so many times, and he's bored, and this new clone of his, this latest one, is also bored of him now. So it's like Eon's collective consciousness, if you want to get schizo about it, spread out between her clones, is getting more and more bored with Trevor. The more of her he creates, the more copies that share her electrochemical brain. The same spirit inhabiting multiple bodies like that is probably an affront to pretty much everything scientific and spiritual you can even imagine. It's beyond heinous. It's utterly insane. And then finally, this latest Eon comes in, but is it her, or is it the real Eon? We don't really know. The show implies that this is actually the real Eon. This is actually her. But we're not sure. But again, because of the situation Trevor's created, his science. I love this scene, man. I wouldn't want you if I was scared of you. I couldn't get hard, is what he's saying. If you intimidate me, if you frighten me, I'll go limp down there. And yes, that's a lurid physical thing, but he's also talking about his own psychology. He goes, I need to feel safe with you, like you're my mother. Again, Freudian crap. But in this series, in the context of this series, it makes sense. Now here we have the quote-unquote real Eon. And again, the reason I said it's ambiguous if this is the real Eon or not is during the scene when they were in the sewer or the whatever, under the bathtub, under the pool, their faces were superimposed. Now the implication of that is they could have switched places. And this Eon that we just saw in the black BDSM leather could be the clone. And the real Eon could be this one. And Trevor implies this because that's his fantasy, is you're actually the real one. All my previous clones were kind of half-baked. They didn't quite work out. I was still getting the process, established. I didn't quite clone you perfectly till now. In his mind, that's how he's justifying it. But they could have actually switched places. And I think, having watched this like 50 times, I think they did switch places. And I think this is actually the real Eon. He says, why did you make the switch? And it could have just been to fuck with him. It could be they didn't switch. That'd be more interesting if they didn't, because it would just be another elaborate scheme of Eons to undermine Trevor's lawful evil playthrough of his little game. But that's what makes this series so great, is whichever possibility you consider, whichever side you take, it's equally interesting. And there's so few pieces of art and media that will present you with two alternatives and actually flesh both of them out equally and make them both equally believable and viable, but also equally meaningful in their implications. That's incredibly hard to do, even just with two alternate endings. I mean, I love this. Again, it's misperception. It's Shakespearean. She thinks because Eon's sleeping the opposite way that he's cloned her. And of course he hasn't. Trevor doesn't have a thing for Russian chicks. He's into whatever Eon is. Jewish, perhaps? Italian? North African, Italian, who knows? Nice bone structure to her face, either way. I understand Trevor's aesthetic obsession. I mean, we know she's a Hyperborean because she's got blue eyes. I mean, that's an obvious indicator. The elves have green eyes. The brown-eyed people are a mixture of a whole bunch of different people. That's just bullshit, guys. I'm just kidding. Again, Scafander's like, I can't let these Western freaks make clones of me, a Russian agent, with ape hand feet. It's too much. But again, this is either the real Eon trying to save the clone, or it's the clone trying to save the real Eon. Now, if you ascribe to the interpretation that this is the clone we're seeing, who gave Scafander the little gun cigarette case thing, then it's the clone sacrificing itself to save the real Eon. That's sort of the more like pro-Eon, good ending kind of interpretation of this. I prefer the other one because it makes the rest of the series a lot weirder and make more sense. And again, you have to watch this series backwards. It's a very creepily arranged series of images. If you watch Season 3 first, and then you watch Season 1 and Season 2 in any order after that, it makes more sense. And that's just a byproduct of how they had to promote the series because they had no money at the beginning and they could only make minute-and-a-half sequences because, you know, animating this shit by hand is absolutely crazy. I can't believe anybody even bothered to do it. But my point is just, if you watch the series in that order, you're sort of watching things backwards. And that creates a kind of weird, as above, so below kind of occultic effect, where the later series was trying to, in reality, explain the dialogue-free vignettes that constitute the first two seasons. That's the real truth of things. But the reason that I'm bringing this up in the first place is, again, because we have these two interpretations of this particular episode, where you have either Eon's clone saves the real Eon, or the real Eon dies so that her clone, who has gotten close to Trevor and gotten to know him more and fucked him, is able to get that out of its system. And actually, in that case, the clone would be a better version of Eon. It would be a version of her that got away with doing something that she had to die in order to accomplish, or a version of her had to die. Now that to me is more interesting because it implies that Eon used Trevor's own clone against him, not by killing the clone, but by killing herself to save the clone. And she waited. Trevor cloned her like 12 times. She waited, and it's implied that all the clones went into the bathtub, the feminine element, right, of water, and went down to her little secret sewer area and talked to her, and she probably looked at the first 10 clones and said, "You're not quite right, just go back and keep fucking him." That's the implication of this. If you're thinking like Eon would think, that's what she would do. She would look at every clone like she looked at the last one. We saw her pull its gums apart, her gums apart. Again, there's dehumanization all over the place in this. But Eon wanted a clone that was close enough to her that she could actually die so the clone could get closer to Trevor than she could. The real Eon couldn't stomach or couldn't bring herself to actually get this close to Trevor. So ironically in this, if you want to think Eon's the villain, if she's the greater psychopath, she has used her clone to replace herself just because she saw in herself a flaw that a naive, newly born clone wouldn't have. And here we have again, repetition of the scene under the pool. And again, like either interpretation is interesting. So ironically, there's a false duality here. It doesn't really matter which Eon is real or which isn't. Either way, there's a huge sacrifice being made. The stars in your eyes, they're stolen. She shames the clone, or the clone shames the real Eon. And that's why I like that interpretation better. It's much more tragic, it's more potent. If the real Eon is the one who fell, who fucked Trevor and fell for his hypnosis and actually genuinely wants to stay with him, that means that it's more tragic because the clone now has to go on. The clone who fucked him a few times but was born to do that and is sort of numb to it. And the other implication is that the real Eon here knew that she was potentially more flawed than a clone of herself. To make him hurt. And that means, too, the implication again is that the real Eon knew she would fail. She sensed in herself that she would fail her mission, that if she got that close to Trevor and actually fucked him, she'd fall for his Scientocracy hypnosis. And because she knew that, she sacrifices herself so that a clone of her can carry on her work. That is wild to me. That's beyond psychopathic. It's totally inhuman. It's crazy. And this series dares to imply it through its visuals. Again, you got to remember the scene when they were under the tub and Eon, the two faces of Eon and the clone were overlapped. And they were overlapped right where their mouths met. Which means when they say impale him on his own ego, if that's the true mission, it doesn't matter which has to be sacrificed, the real version of her or the clone. It doesn't matter. If the mission is all that matters, that's all that matters. And only Eon, only some version of her has to survive. And because she's blown up the cloning facility. She's destroyed the genetic samples. Trevor's going to have to rebuild the whole damn thing. And if you watch the first 2 seasons, it's implied that he does. He does rebuild it. Because of course he'd have the designs saved. He's not an idiot. And again, I talked about this scene in the previous review where this version of Eon gets killed. One of the most brutal scenes of unrequited love and human folly and tragedy in anything. I think if Shakespeare were alive, he'd be making this, or he'd be watching it. And that line cuts my heart in half, man. Where they're like, "Sir, we can kill her. Do you want us to kill her?" And he goes, "No, let her go. I'd rather there was a clone of her or the real her. Just some version of her out there. I'd rather there was some part of her that still exists." And maybe he's learned his lesson, but of course, we've got another 6 episodes. Trevor does not learn lessons easily. He has to be taught brutally and repeatedly. He's a very stubborn fuck. But anyway, guys, the episode's been over for a couple seconds, so I'm going to end this commentary and recording. I hope you enjoyed it, and there's more to come, so stay tuned. And as always, peace out.